April 15th, 1818, late afternoon, and the spring rain fell in steady sheets against the narrow attic window where Clara Pembroke bent over her work, needle poised above ivory silk that seemed to glow despite the dim light. At 32, she had long since grown accustomed to this particular ache in her shoulders, this familiar strain behind her eyes that forced her to remove her spectacles every quarter hour and press her fingers to the bridge of her nose. The dress spread across her workbench was a wedding gown, though not her own. Never her own. It had belonged first to her cousin Lydia, radiant Lydia, who had married Lord Hastings just 8 months prior in a ceremony that had filled St. George's with white roses and whispered envy. Now Clara was altering it for Eleanor, the second cousin to secure an advantageous match, soon to become Lady Sinclair, with all the consequence that title implied. Her needle moved with practiced precision through the delicate fabric, adding seed pearls along the bodice in a pattern she had designed herself, a pattern no one but she would ever know was her creation. This was Clara's gift, and her curse. The ability to make beautiful things that other women would wear into beautiful lives, while she remained here in this cramped space, under the eaves of Madame Montague's dress shop, surrounded by silks and satins and laces that would never adorn her own unremarkable form. She had learned not to imagine herself in these gowns, had trained herself over years to see only the technical challenges they presented, the way light caught on beadwork, the precise tension required for stitches in such fine materials. But sometimes, when the rain fell like this and the afternoon stretched long and grey, she could not help the small rebellion of her thoughts. She wondered what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen, not as the poor relation with the steady hands and the accommodating nature, but as a woman worthy of regard. The notion was foolish, she knew. Her mirror told her daily what the world had long since confirmed. She was plain where her cousins were lovely, aging where they had been fresh, invisible where they had been luminous. Her hands were her finest feature, long-fingered and clever, but who looked at hands when there were faces to admire? Who noticed the artistry in her stitching when the woman wearing the dress drew every eye? Clara set down her needle and flexed her cramped fingers, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of the shop below. The murmur of wealthy clients being attended to by women with more beauty and less skill than she possessed. This was her place, this attic room with its slanted ceiling and its northern light, its neat rows of thread, and its profound solitude. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The rain had softened to a whisper against the windows by the time Rebecca Montague appeared in the doorway of Clara's workroom, her presence announced by the gentle rustle of taffeta skirts and the subtle fragrance of bergamot that always accompanied her. Clara looked up from the seed pearls she had been setting with such meticulous care, blinking against the strain in her eyes, and found her employer regarding her with an expression that mingled warmth with something else, something almost conspiratorial that Clara could not quite interpret. Rebecca was perhaps 45, a widow who had built her dressmaking establishment through equal measures of talent and determination, and she had always treated Clara with a kindness that went beyond mere professional courtesy, as though she recognized in her seamstress a kinship of women who had learned to make their own way in a world that offered them little assistance. "Come downstairs, Clara," Rebecca said, her voice low and careful. "There is a matter requiring your particular expertise." Clara set aside the wedding gown with its half-finished embellishments, removed her spectacles, and followed Rebecca down the narrow staircase that connected her attic domain to the elegant rooms below, where clients were received and fittings conducted. The shop had grown quiet in the early evening hour, The last customers departed, and the showroom glowed softly in the light of candles being lit by Jenny, the young shop assistant who bobbed a quick curtsy as they passed. Rebecca led Clara to the private fitting room at the back of the establishment, a space reserved for the most prestigious commissions, and there upon the velvet-draped table lay something that made Clara catch her breath. It was a christening gown, clearly very old, the lace so delicate it seemed spun from morning mist, the tiny stitches worked by hands long since dust. The fabric had yellowed slightly with age, and there were places where the threads had weakened. Small tears that would require extraordinary skill to repair without destroying the integrity of the original work. "This arrived this afternoon," Rebecca said quietly, and her voice carried a weight that suggested this was no ordinary commission. "It belongs to the Duke of Ravencross. He requires it restored for his godson's christening next month. He was quite specific that only our finest seamstress should touch it, that it is a family heirloom of great sentimental value." Clara felt her hands tremble slightly as she reached out, not yet touching the gown, but hovering above it as though she might divine its secrets through proximity alone. "The Duke of Ravencross," she repeated, the name carrying with it all the whispered rumours that circulated through London, drawing rooms and servants' halls alike. Rebecca nodded, watching Clara's face carefully. "The very same," she confirmed. "I confess I know little of him beyond his reputation, which is considerable and not altogether reassuring. They say he is dangerous, that he has fought more duels than any gentleman should, that he gambles fortunes on the turn of a card, and has broken hearts across 3 counties. They say also that he has never shown interest in marrying, that he keeps himself apart from the usual society matchmaking, that there is something solitary and rather forbidding about him. But his man of business was most courteous when he delivered the gown, and the Duke's instructions were clear. He wishes it handled with the utmost care, and he is willing to pay handsomely for work of the highest quality." Clara lifted the gown at last, feeling the weight of history in her hands, seeing in the fading light the artistry of some long-ago needlewoman who had worked these stitches with love. To restore such a piece would require every bit of skill she possessed, every hour of experience gained through years of patient labor in dim rooms. It would be a challenge worthy of her abilities, recognition of a sort she had rarely received. "I will do it," she said softly, and Rebecca smiled, a smile that suggested she had expected no other answer, that she had known Clara would not be able to resist the call of such work, despite whatever trepidation the Duke's dark reputation might inspire. April 22nd, 1818, and the morning light came clear and bright through the eastern window of Clara's workroom, the kind of crystalline spring illumination that made colours true and stitches visible without strain. And she had risen early to take advantage of it, the christening gown spread before her like something sacred, as she worked to repair a section of lace so delicate it seemed it might dissolve at her touch. She had been absorbed in this precise surgery of thread and patience for perhaps 2 hours, her world narrowed to the microscopic landscape of warp and weft, the careful navigation of her needle through fabric that had survived a century only to require her intervention now, and she was so thoroughly lost in this meditation of craft that she did not hear the footsteps on the stairs, did not sense the presence in her doorway until some instinct made her glance up to find a man watching her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. He was tall and dark in a way that suggested danger rather than mere colouring. His coat fitted perfectly across shoulders that spoke of physical power, his face angular and severe, marked by experiences she could not begin to guess at, and there was something in his stillness that reminded her of a predator, patient and utterly focused, though what had captured his attention with such complete absorption was apparently herself. Clara felt the blood rise to her cheeks as she set down her needle with hands that trembled slightly, removing her spectacles in an automatic gesture of self-consciousness, rising from her stool with the awkwardness of a woman unused to being observed. "Your Grace," she managed, for there could be no question who this was. The Duke of Ravencross himself arrived without announcement into her private sanctuary. She had not expected him to come here, had assumed Rebecca would handle any consultation about the gown, and his presence in this small space made the room feel suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as though he brought with him some quality that displaced the ordinary atmosphere. He moved then, stepping fully into the workroom with a grace that belied his size, and his eyes went to the christening gown spread on her table, studying it with what appeared to be genuine interest, before returning to her face with that same unsettling focus. "You have nearly completed it," he said, and his voice was deep and carefully modulated, the accent of education and privilege. "I had not dared hope for such swift progress with such delicate work." Clara found her voice somewhere beneath her confusion. "The lace required careful handling, Your Grace," she replied, hearing the slight quaver she could not quite suppress. Some of the original stitching had weakened with age, but the pattern was still evident enough to guide the restoration. "I have tried to remain faithful to the original needlewoman's intent." He stepped closer, close enough that she could detect the scent of sandalwood, and something else, something masculine and indefinable. And he bent to examine the gown with what seemed to be genuine understanding of the work she had done. "You have extraordinary hands," he said quietly, and the intimacy of the observation made her pulse quicken with alarm. "I watched you working just now, before you noticed me, and I have never seen such complete absorption, such unity of intention and execution. You were not merely repairing lace, Miss Pembroke. You were communing with it to me." The words were so unexpected, so far beyond any response she might have anticipated, that Clara could find no reply, could only stand there feeling exposed and strangely vulnerable, as though he had seen something she had not intended to reveal. He straightened then, and his dark eyes met hers directly. "I find I am in need of additional work," he said, and there was something deliberate in his tone that suggested this was not entirely about needlework, something personal that would benefit from your particular artistry. "Something personal," he had said, and the words hung in the air between them with a weight that Clara could not quite comprehend, her mind still reeling from his observation about her hands, about the communion he claimed to have witnessed between herself and the lace she had been repairing. She took a small step backward, a reflexive retreat from the intensity of his presence, and found herself pressed against her work table with nowhere else to go in the small confines of her attic sanctuary. "What manner of work did your Grace have in mind?" she managed, trying to summon the professional demeanor that usually came so naturally to her, but which seemed to have deserted her entirely under the dark scrutiny of his gaze. Alexander Drummond regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he reached into his coat and withdrew a square of fine linen, a gentleman's handkerchief of the sort that any valet could have embroidered, or any shop could have provided. "I require a dozen of these," he said, his voice carrying an odd formality that seemed at variance with the intimacy of the request. "I wish them embroidered, but not with my crest or initials as would be customary. I want something else, something of your own design, whatever pattern or motif you deem appropriate." Clara stared at him, confusion replacing her nervousness, as she tried to make sense of a commission that made no practical sense whatsoever. "Your Grace?" she began carefully. "Surely your household staff could accomplish such work, or any of a dozen shops in London could provide embroidered handkerchiefs to your specifications. There is no need to trouble yourself with such a minor matter." But he shook his head, and there was something almost stubborn in the set of his jaw. "I do not want my household staff to do it," he said, and his eyes held hers with that same unsettling intensity. "I do not want a dozen shops in London to provide their standard offerings. I want your work, Miss Pembroke, and more than that, I want your judgment. I do not wish to dictate the design. I wish you to choose it, to select whatever you think appropriate, to apply your own artistic sensibility to this commission." It was the most irregular request Clara had ever received, stripping away the usual dynamic where a client specified their requirements and she executed them with faithful precision. He was asking her not merely for her skill, but for her taste, her creativity, her personal aesthetic judgment, and the intimacy of that request felt almost improper, as though he were asking to see something private and unguarded. She felt her cheeks grow warm again, and she looked away from his face to the handkerchief he still held, focusing on its neutral whiteness as though it might provide some anchor against the strange vertigo she felt. "I am not certain I understand what your grace requires," she said quietly. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool morning air, and he placed the handkerchief on her work table beside the christening gown. "I require you to trust your own artistry," he said, and his voice had dropped to something lower, more intimate. "I require you to believe that your judgment has value beyond its mere technical execution. Choose whatever design pleases you, Miss Pembroke, and I shall be content with your choice." Then he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the stairs, leaving Clara standing alone in her workroom with a commission she did not understand, and a confusion that went deeper than mere professional bewilderment. And when Rebecca appeared in the doorway moments later with a knowing expression that suggested she had observed the Duke's departure, Clara could only shake her head mutely, unable to articulate the strange mixture of fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, that had taken root beneath her ribs. May 3rd, 1818, and the afternoon had brought with it the kind of warmth that promised summer was approaching, the light slanting through Clara's workroom window with a golden quality that made her think of honey and harvest, though such pastoral thoughts were far from her usual urban existence, and she had just finished folding the completed handkerchiefs into their linen wrapping when she heard his footsteps on the stairs, and her heart performed that now familiar acceleration that both alarmed and exhilarated her. For this was his third visit in 11 days, and she had begun to mark time by his appearances, measuring her weeks not by Sundays, but by the intervals between his arrivals. She rose from her stool as he entered, and there was something easier in his manner now, a familiarity that had replaced the initial formality of their first encounters, though his presence still made the small room feel smaller and the air feel thicker with possibility. "Your Grace," she greeted him, gesturing to the wrapped parcel on her work table. "I have completed the handkerchiefs as you requested. I hope the design proves satisfactory." She had chosen to embroider them with small sprigs of rosemary, the herb for remembrance, and she had not examined too closely her reasons for selecting that particular motif, though some part of her recognized it as a wish. A hope that she might be remembered when he inevitably moved on to more important matters. He unwrapped the parcel with care and studied the first handkerchief for a long moment, his dark eyes tracing the delicate stitches, and when he looked up at her, his expression held something she could not quite identify. "They are extraordinary," he said quietly. "Rosemary. For remembrance. You chose well, Miss Pembroke." The fact that he recognized the symbolism made her pulse quicken again, suggesting an education and sensibility beyond mere aristocratic privilege, and she found herself smiling despite her intention to maintain professional distance. "I am pleased they meet with your approval," she managed. And then, because some reckless part of her wanted to prolong his visit, she added, I have also sketched some preliminary designs for the waistcoat embroidery you mentioned, if your Grace has time to review them. It was forward of her, she knew, to assume he would wish to linger, but he settled into the chair near the window as though he had all the time in the world, and when she brought him her sketchbook, their fingers brushed, and the contact sent a shock through her that she felt to her bones. He studied her drawings with apparent genuine interest, asking questions about thread choices and stitch techniques. But then the conversation shifted, became more personal, as he asked her opinion on a debate currently raging in Parliament about educational reform, a topic so far removed from needlework that Clara initially thought she had misheard him. When she hesitantly offered her thoughts, born of her own limited education and her observations of the women who worked in Rebecca's shop, he listened with complete attention, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and then he responded with his own views, and suddenly they were having a conversation, a real exchange of ideas, as though her thoughts had value beyond their utility to his wardrobe. And Clara felt something dangerous blooming in her chest, a hope she knew she should suppress, but could not quite extinguish, even as she warned herself that his courtesy was merely good breeding, that a duke speaking kindly to a seamstress meant nothing more than a gentleman being polite to someone providing a service. And yet when he finally departed, taking the handkerchiefs and promising to return in a week to discuss the waistcoat further, she found herself standing at her window watching his figure disappear down the street, and she realized with a mixture of terror and wonder that she was waiting for him, that she had begun to hope for his visits, and that this hoping was the most dangerous thing she had allowed herself in years. May 10th, 1818, and the evening had brought Clara to her Aunt Margaret's house in Bloomsbury for the weekly family dinner that had become both ritual and ordeal, the kind of obligation that could not be avoided without causing offence, yet which she never anticipated with anything approaching pleasure. And as she sat in the familiar dining room, with its pale yellow wallpaper and portraits of ancestors who had never acknowledged her branch of the family, she felt the familiar sensation of becoming invisible, of shrinking into herself until she occupied as little space as possible. Lydia sat across from her in a gown of sapphire silk that set off her golden hair and blue eyes to perfection, and Eleanor beside her wore rose-coloured muslin that complemented her darker beauty, and Clara in her serviceable grey dress felt like a shadow at a table of light, a familiar role she had occupied for so many years that she had almost ceased to notice the ache of it. Lydia was recounting her recent triumph at Lady Westbrook's musical, where she had sung and been complimented by no fewer than 3 viscounts and an earl, and Eleanor was describing the new furnishings she had commissioned for her drawing-room, and Aunt Margaret presided over it all with satisfied approval, her daughters having fulfilled every ambition she had harboured for them, while Clara cut her mutton into small pieces and tried to contribute the occasional murmur of interest at appropriate moments. But then Aunt Margaret turned to her with that particular expression of duty-bound attention that suggested she had remembered Clara's presence and felt obligated to include her, and she asked what Clara had been occupying herself with at the dress shop, and Clara, made incautious by the week of Alexander's visits and the dangerous hope that had been building in her chest despite all her efforts to suppress it, mentioned that she had been working on several commissions for the Duke of Ravenscross. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the ticking of the mantel clock, and then Lydia laughed, a bright tinkling sound that held no warmth whatsoever, and said surely Clara meant that the shop had received commissions from the Duke's household, not that the Duke himself had been calling personally, because everyone knew that the Duke of Ravenscross was the most notorious bachelor in London, a man who gambled away fortunes and had fought 2 duels and had never shown the slightest interest in respectable matrimony, and Eleanor added with false concern that Clara should be careful not to mistake a nobleman's courtesy to a tradeswoman for anything more significant, that men of rank were often polite to those who provided services, and Aunt Margaret said with a sharpness that cut deeper than her daughter's mockery that she hoped Clara was not entertaining foolish notions above her station, that at 32, and with no prospects, she should be grateful for her employment and not indulge in fantasies that could only lead to disappointment and disgrace. Clara felt her face burn and her throat tighten, and she looked down at her plate and said nothing, because what could she say? How could she explain that the Duke had asked her opinion on matters unrelated to needlework, that he had looked at her as though she were something other than invisible, that for the first time in her life she had felt seen? And yet her family's words found their mark in the vulnerable places she tried so hard to protect. And by the time she left an hour later, pleading fatigue and escaping into the cool spring evening, she had retreated so far back into herself that the hope of the past weeks felt like a dangerous delusion, and she walked home through streets growing dark and told herself that her aunt was right, that she had been foolish to imagine that a duke's kindness meant anything more than the courtesy any gentleman might show to someone performing a service, and the ache in her chest felt like grief for something she had never truly possessed. May 17th, 1818, and the late morning had brought with it the kind of warmth that made Clara open the workroom windows, despite the noise from the street below, and she could hear the calls of flower sellers and the rumble of carriage wheels as she bent over the waistcoat embroidery that had occupied her hands, but not her thoughts, for the past week. Because her thoughts remained trapped in that dining room in Bloomsbury, where her aunt's words had found every vulnerable place in her heart, and reminded her that hoping was dangerous, that believing herself worthy of more than invisibility was a delusion that could only lead to pain. She heard his footsteps on the stairs and felt her body tense in a way it had not done during his previous visits, felt herself drawing inward and constructing walls that had been slowly crumbling during the weeks of his attention, and when he entered the workroom she did not rise or meet his eyes, but kept her focus on her stitching, as though the placement of each thread required such concentration that she could spare no awareness for anything else. "Your Grace," she said quietly, and even she could hear the difference in her voice. The return to that careful blankness she had cultivated for years as protection against disappointment. She sensed rather than saw him stop just inside the doorway, and the silence stretched long enough that she was forced to look up, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her want to look away again. "What has happened?" he said, and it was not a question, but a statement delivered in a tone that suggested he already knew something had shifted, even if he did not know the cause. "Nothing, Your Grace," Clara replied, and returned her attention to the embroidery. "I have made progress on the waistcoat, as you can see. I expect to have it completed within the fortnight." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and she felt the air change as he came to stand beside her work table. Too close for propriety. But then propriety had been quietly eroding between them for weeks, and she had allowed it because she had been foolish enough to hope. "Miss Pembroke," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her hands still on the fabric. "Clara, look at me." The sound of her Christian name in his mouth sent a shock through her that she tried desperately to suppress, and she looked up slowly and met his dark eyes, and saw concern there, and something fiercer beneath it. "Who has hurt you?" he asked quietly. "No one," she said. "I simply think it best that we return to a more appropriate degree of formality in our dealings. You have been very kind, but I would not wish to presume upon your courtesy or mistake your gentlemanly attention for something it is not." She watched something flash in his eyes, anger, perhaps, or frustration, and he placed both hands on her work table and leaned forward slightly. "Is that what you think?" he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that suggested the opposite of control beneath the surface. "That my attention has been merely courtesy. That I have been kind to you in the way one might be kind to any tradeswoman providing a service." She felt her throat tighten and could not answer, and he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "I have spent the better part of 6 weeks finding excuses to return to this workroom. I have commissioned items I do not need, and requested alterations that were unnecessary. I have asked your opinion on matters that have nothing to do with needlework because I value your mind and your perspective. I have looked forward to these visits more than any social engagement or business matter. And you believe this is simple courtesy?" Clara felt something crack inside her chest, felt the walls she had been trying to rebuild begin to crumble again, despite her best efforts. "My family," she began, and then stopped because she did not know how to explain the poison they had poured into her ears, the way they had taken her hope and shown her how foolish it looked in the harsh light of their judgment. "Your family," he repeated, and now the anger in his voice was unmistakable. "Your family who have overlooked you and dismissed you and failed to see what is plainly before them. Your family who measure worth by beauty and rank and cannot conceive that someone might value qualities they themselves do not possess." He straightened, and she saw him struggle to contain his fury. "Tell me what they said to you." She shook her head, unable to repeat the words, but he persisted with a gentleness that somehow made it worse. "Clara," he said again, that dangerous intimacy of her name. "Please." And so she told him, haltingly, about the dinner and their mockery and their certainty that no nobleman would truly want someone like her. And as she spoke, she watched his hands curl into fists at his sides. When she finished, there was a long silence, filled only with the sounds from the street below, and then he spoke, and his voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "You are beautiful," he said. Clara's head snapped up, and she stared at him in disbelief, and he held her gaze without wavering. "You are beautiful in ways they cannot comprehend because they have never looked beyond surfaces. You are beautiful in your skill and your intelligence and your quiet dignity. You are beautiful in the way you focus on your work with complete absorption. You are beautiful in your kindness and your strength and your refusal to become bitter despite years of being overlooked. And I am not being kind when I say this. I am being honest." She felt tears prick her eyes and shook her head, unable to accept what he was offering, because accepting it would mean hoping again, and hoping had already proven too dangerous. "Your Grace," she whispered, "please. You do not need to say such things. I do not expect anything from you. I know my place." "Your place," he said, and there was something almost fierce in his tone now, "is wherever you choose it to be, not where your family has decided it should be, not where society presumes it must be. And if you will allow it, I should very much like your place to be beside me." She could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at him as he watched her with an expression that held determination and tenderness, and something else she was afraid to name. And then he straightened and took a step back, and his voice became more controlled, though no less intense. "I will not press you today," he said. "You need time to consider what I have said. But Clara, believe this if you believe nothing else. When I look at you, I see someone extraordinary, and I will continue to see that regardless of what anyone else chooses to believe." He left then, and Clara sat alone in her workroom with her hands trembling and her heart racing and the echoes of his words filling the space he had occupied. And she did not return to her embroidery but simply sat there as the morning deepened toward afternoon and wondered if it was possible that someone might truly see her as he claimed to, and whether she could find the courage to believe him. May 24th, 1818, and the afternoon sun slanted through the workroom windows with a warmth that spoke of approaching summer, casting golden light across the work table where Clara sat with her hands idle for once, not because she had no work to do, but because her mind could not settle to the task, not when Alexander had sent word that morning requesting permission to call upon her at 3 o'clock, and Rebecca had read the note with an expression of such knowing warmth that Clara had felt her face heat, even as her heart had begun that dangerous racing that his mere name could now provoke. He arrived precisely on time, as he always did, but today he was accompanied by Rebecca herself, who had insisted on coming upstairs from the showroom below, and the presence of her employer made Clara suddenly aware that this visit was different from all the others, that something had shifted in a way she could not yet name, but could feel in the tension of the air itself. "Your Grace?" Clara said as she rose from her work table, and he bowed with that particular grace that spoke of a lifetime of privilege and training. But his eyes never left her face, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Miss Pembroke," he said, and then with a glance at Rebecca, who had taken a seat near the window with her own needlework, as though she had every intention of remaining, he continued in a voice that was formal, but carried beneath it currents of something far more intimate. "I have come to ask if you would do me the honor of walking with me in Hyde Park tomorrow afternoon." The words hung in the air between them, and Clara felt her chest tighten with a confusion of emotions, because what he was asking was not simply a walk, but something far more significant, a public acknowledgement of association that would be noticed and remarked upon, that would attach her name to his in the minds of anyone who saw them together. "Your Grace." "I cannot," she said quietly, and she saw his expression tighten almost imperceptibly. "Why not?" he asked, and there was no anger in his tone but genuine question, as though he truly could not fathom her refusal. "Because it would not be proper," Clara replied, her hands twisting together in front of her. "Because people would talk and speculate, and it would cause you scandal to be seen with someone like me in such a public manner." "Someone like you," he repeated, and now there was an edge to his voice. "You mean someone of intelligence and skill and quiet grace, someone who has more dignity in her smallest gesture than half the women of the ton possess in their entire beings." She shook her head, unable to accept his characterization even as her heart yearned to believe it. "I mean someone without rank or fortune or beauty," she said. "Someone whose presence beside you would cause gossip and mockery. Your Grace, please understand, I am grateful for your kindness, but I cannot allow you to damage your reputation for my sake." He took a step closer, and she could smell the scent of him, something clean and masculine that made her aware of his physical presence in a way that left her almost dizzy. "What if I were to make it entirely respectable?" he said. "What if Mrs. Montague were to accompany us as chaperone? Would you object then?" Clara looked helplessly at Rebecca, who met her gaze with an expression of gentle encouragement. "I should be honored to serve as chaperone," Rebecca said quietly. "If Clara is willing, I see no impropriety in such an arrangement." And Clara found herself caught between her fear and her longing, between the part of her that had learned through years of disappointment to expect nothing, and the newer, more fragile part that had been growing since the morning he had first walked into her workroom and looked at her as though she were something rare and valuable. She could feel the weight of his attention, the patience with which he waited for her answer, and she thought of how he had seen through her defenses the week before, how he had spoken words she had never imagined hearing, and she realized that refusing him now would be not protection, but cowardice, a retreat into the safety of invisibility that had once been refuge, but had become prison. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she heard herself say, and the words came out barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of decision, of surrender, of terrifying hope. His face transformed with a smile that reached his dark eyes and made him look younger, less dangerous, more simply happy than she had yet seen him. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, then," he said. "I shall call for you both here. And Clara, you need not fear the opinions of people who matter far less than you imagine." After he left, Rebecca crossed the room and took Clara's trembling hands in her own warm ones. "You have nothing appropriate to wear for a walk in Hyde Park," she said matter-of-factly. "We shall have to do something about that." And so they had spent the rest of the afternoon and much of the evening altering one of Rebecca's own dresses, a pale green muslin that with adjustments to the hem and waist would fit Clara well enough, and as Clara stitched with hands that had finally steadied, she felt something very much like joy beginning to bloom beneath her ribs, fragile and precious, and absolutely terrifying. May 26th, 1818. And the afternoon sun held the particular golden quality of late spring as Alexander handed Clara up into his carriage, with Rebecca already settled on the opposite seat, and Clara felt the warmth of his gloved hand through the thin fabric of her own borrowed gloves, felt the strength in his grip, and the way his fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary, before he released her and climbed in after, settling beside her close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the pale green muslin that Rebecca had spent 2 evenings altering to fit her narrower frame. The drive to Hyde Park took only 15 minutes, but Clara was aware of every second, aware of the way people on the street turned to look as the ducal carriage passed, aware of Rebecca's kind eyes watching her with gentle amusement, aware most of all of Alexander beside her, speaking of inconsequential things in that deep voice that seemed to resonate somewhere beneath her ribs. When they arrived at the park entrance near the Serpentine, the fashionable hour was in full bloom, with carriages and riders and pedestrians filling the paths in that elaborate social dance that Clara had only ever observed from the greatest distance, and as Alexander handed her down and offered his arm, she felt her legs trembling beneath her skirts and wondered if he could feel her shaking through the contact. The moment her hand settled into the crook of his elbow, she felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward them, felt the weight of attention like a physical pressure against her skin, and she heard the whispers begin almost immediately, that sibilant hiss of speculation and curiosity that followed them as they began to walk along Rotten Row, with Rebecca a discreet distance behind. "Who is she?" she heard a woman murmur to her companion, and another voice answering, "No one knows, some seamstress, I believe," and then a man's voice thick with amusement saying, "Ravencross always did have peculiar tastes." Clara felt her face flush hot, and her steps faltered slightly, but Alexander's hand came to cover hers where it rested on his arm, warm and solid and absolutely steady, and he leaned close enough that she could smell the clean scent of him, and said quietly, "Look at me, not at them." She raised her eyes to his face and found him watching her with an expression of such focused attention that the rest of the park seemed to blur into insignificance, and he smiled at her. A real smile that transformed his usually severe features into something approaching beauty. "Tell me," he said in a conversational tone, as though they were quite alone, "what you thought of that volume of poetry I recommended last week." She blinked at him, struggling to shift her thoughts from the watching eyes to his question, and then remembered the book he had mentioned during his last visit to the workroom. "I found it very moving," she managed to say, "though I confess some of the metaphors seemed obscure to me." His smile deepened, and they continued walking, and he began to discuss the poems with her, drawing out her opinions and responding to them with a seriousness that suggested he valued her thoughts genuinely, and slowly Clara felt herself beginning to breathe more easily, despite the continued attention from every side. They passed a group of elegant ladies who Clara recognized from descriptions her cousins had given, members of the highest circles of society, and she saw their eyes widen and their heads draw together in immediate gossip. But Alexander merely nodded to them with cool courtesy and continued his conversation with Clara as though nothing else in the world held any interest for him. Near the water's edge they paused to watch the swans gliding across the sunlit surface, and Alexander adjusted their position slightly, his hand moving to her elbow to guide her, and even through her sleeve and his glove she felt the warmth of that contact like a brand, felt the intimacy of it in a way that made her breathless. "This is where I come sometimes in the early morning," he said quietly, "when I need to think. It is quite different without the crowds, peaceful in a way that allows clarity." She looked up at him and saw that he was gazing out across the water with an expression of unusual openness. "You are sharing your private places with me," she said softly, and he turned to meet her eyes. "I am sharing everything with you," he replied, and there was such weight in those simple words that Clara felt something shift and settle in her chest, some last barrier beginning to dissolve. They walked for another 20 minutes, and Clara gradually became less aware of the watching eyes and more absorbed in the simple pleasure of his company, the way he listened to her words as though they mattered, the way his presence beside her made her feel both protected and visible in a way she had never experienced. When they finally returned to the carriage, her feet aching slightly in Rebecca's borrowed half-boots and her face warm from sun and attention, she felt as though she had travelled much farther than the circumference of the park's fashionable paths, felt as though she had stepped into a new world where she was no longer invisible, but seen, truly seen, by the one person whose vision seemed to matter more with each passing day. June 2nd, 1818, and the evening had settled over London with that soft twilight that turned the city golden and gentle, and Clara sat in Alexander's carriage beside Rebecca, feeling as though she were travelling to some impossible destination, because he had sent word that morning inviting her to dine at his home in Grosvenor Square, an invitation so shockingly intimate that Rebecca had insisted on accompanying her, despite Alexander's assurance that his own staff would provide adequate chaperonage. And now, as the carriage drew up before the elegant townhouse with its classical facade and polished brass fittings, Clara felt her breath catch with a mixture of terror and anticipation that had become familiar over these past weeks. The butler who admitted them was an elderly man with kind eyes who showed no surprise or disapproval at Clara's modest appearance, and he led them through an entrance hall that made Clara acutely aware of the vast difference between her world and Alexander's, past marble columns and gilt-framed portraits and furnishings that spoke of generations of wealth and privilege. But then Alexander himself appeared at the top of the staircase and descended to meet them with such genuine pleasure, lighting his severe features, that Clara forgot to feel intimidated by her surroundings. "Miss Pembroke, Mrs. Montague," he said with a bow that was formal, but his eyes when they met Clara's held warmth that made her feel suddenly breathless. "Thank you for honouring my invitation." He led them not to the grand formal dining room that Clara glimpsed through open doors, but to a smaller chamber on the first floor, intimate and comfortable, with only a single table set for 3, and Clara realized with a jolt of understanding that he had deliberately chosen this space to make her feel less overwhelmed, that he had considered her comfort in every detail. Another gentleman rose as they entered. A man perhaps 40 years of age, with a military bearing and an open, friendly face, and Alexander introduced him as Francis Carstairs, his oldest friend, and Clara saw the way Francis looked at her with frank curiosity, and something that might have been approval. Francis had served with Alexander in Spain during the war, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries he excused himself with a bow, explaining that he had another engagement, but Clara understood that his presence had been meant to further establish the respectability of the evening, another consideration for her reputation. The dinner that followed was unlike anything Clara had experienced, not because of the food, though it was excellent, but because of the conversation that flowed between them with an ease that felt both natural and precious, and she found herself speaking of things she had never shared with anyone: her childhood love of stories, her discovery that needlework could be a form of artistry, her quiet dreams that she had thought long buried. Alexander listened with that complete attention he always gave her, asking questions that revealed genuine interest. And then he began to share his own history in a way he had not done before, speaking of his parents who had died when he was 19, leaving him suddenly responsible for vast estates and a dukedom he had not felt prepared to manage, of the loneliness of his position that had made genuine connection nearly impossible because everyone who approached him wanted something, or feared him, or saw only his rank and never the man beneath. "I learned early to trust very few people," he said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers across the small table, while Rebecca sat nearby with her needlework, affecting not to listen, but Clara knew she heard every word. "I learned that most of society is concerned only with appearance and advantage, and that sincerity is rare enough to be remarkable." And then, with a slight smile that transformed his face, he added, "Which is why, when I encounter it, I recognize its value immediately." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion she could not name, something too large and overwhelming to be simple gratitude. "You speak as though I am somehow exceptional," she said softly, "but I am only a seamstress with no particular distinction. You are a woman of integrity and talent who has remained kind despite being overlooked," he replied, and there was such conviction in his voice that Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "You are honest and true, and you see the world clearly without the distortions of vanity or greed. Those qualities are far more rare than beauty or rank and infinitely more valuable." They sat for another hour in that intimate room while the candles burned lower and the summer darkness deepened outside the windows, and Alexander told her of his estate in Derbyshire, where he spent as much time as duty allowed, describing the hills and forests with such vividness that Clara could almost see them, and he spoke of his hope to fill the empty nurseries there, to have a family that would transform the silent halls into a home. When he finally escorted them back to the carriage, he handed Clara up himself, and held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and he said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "I want you to understand that my intentions are entirely serious, Miss Pembroke, that what is happening between us is not some passing fancy, but the beginning of something I hope will last the remainder of our lives." And though he stopped short of an actual proposal, Clara understood that she had just received a declaration, that this man who could have any woman in England had chosen her, and was asking in his careful, deliberate way if she would choose him in return. June 8th, 1818, and the afternoon light fell warm and golden through the windows of Aunt Margaret's dining room, where Clara sat once again surrounded by family. But this time everything was different, because she carried within her a joy so profound and transformative that she felt it must be visible in her very bearing, and indeed, when she had arrived, Lydia had looked at her with narrowed eyes and said, "You look remarkably pleased with yourself, cousin. What has happened?" And Clara had taken a breath and allowed herself to speak the words that still felt impossible, even as they were true. "The Duke of Ravenscross has been courting me these past weeks, and his intentions are entirely serious." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of carriages in the street. And then Lydia laughed, a sharp, bright sound without warmth, and said, "Courting you? Clara, really, you must not mistake politeness for genuine interest. The Duke is merely being kind about your needlework." Eleanor, who sat beside their aunt, spoke more gently, but with equal dismissiveness, saying, "Surely you understand that a man of his rank and fortune could never seriously consider a match with someone in your position. He must have dozens of eligible ladies pursuing him." Aunt Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care and fixed Clara with a look that held calculation beneath concern, and she said in measured tones, "Clara dear, you must be sensible about this. The Duke of Ravencross is notorious for his liaisons, and I fear he may be amusing himself at your expense. You cannot truly believe he means marriage." Clara felt the familiar pattern beginning, that old habit of retreat and silence when faced with their dismissal. But something had changed in her during these weeks with Alexander, something that had taken root when he looked at her as though she held value beyond measure, and she found herself sitting straighter and meeting her aunt's eyes directly as she said, "He has stated his intentions clearly, and I have no reason to doubt his sincerity. He is a man of honor, whatever gossip may say of him." Lydia's expression shifted from amusement to something harder and colder, and Clara saw envy there, naked and ugly beneath the beautiful features. And Lydia said, with deliberate cruelty, "You foolish creature, do you truly believe that the most notorious duke in London would choose a 32-year-old spinster seamstress when he could have any beauty in society? He must be laughing behind your back. Or perhaps he has some other motive we cannot fathom. Perhaps he enjoys the novelty of pretending to court someone so impossibly unsuitable." The words struck like physical blows, but Clara forced herself to remain steady, forced herself to remember the way Alexander had held her hand across the dinner table and spoken of his hope for a future together. And she said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even herself, "You speak of unsuitability, but you know nothing of what he values. He is not like the men you have known. He sees worth where others see only surface, and he has chosen me with full awareness of who and what I am." Eleanor made a soft, distressed sound and reached toward Clara, saying, "We are only trying to protect you from disappointment. Surely you must see how unlikely this is. What could a duke possibly want with you?" And Clara heard in that question all the years of being overlooked and dismissed and judged insufficient. Aunt Margaret's voice turned sharp with authority as she said, "I forbid you to continue this association, Clara. You are making yourself ridiculous and bringing embarrassment to the family. When this man tires of his game, you will be left with nothing but shame, and we will all suffer the scandal." Clara stood then, her hands trembling but her voice steady, and she said something she had never said before in this house. "I am not a child to be commanded, Aunt. I am a woman of 32 years, and I will make my own choices. The Duke has shown me nothing but respect and genuine regard, and I will not abandon that, because you cannot believe I am worthy of it." She left before they could respond, walking out of the dining room and through the entrance hall and onto the street, where the June afternoon felt suddenly brighter and more vivid, and though her hands still shook and her heart raced with the shock of her own defiance, Clara felt something like pride beginning to bloom alongside the hurt, because for the first time in her life she had defended herself and the man who loved her, and she understood that this was part of what Alexander had been trying to teach her, that she possessed value whether her family acknowledged it or not, though the poison of their words still worked in her blood, making her wonder if perhaps they were right after all. June 15th, 1818, and the late afternoon had turned heavy with the promise of rain, dark clouds gathering over London in a way that seemed to mirror the gathering darkness in Clara's own heart, because the week since her confrontation with her family had passed in a state of precarious joy, shadowed always by doubt that crept in during the quiet hours, and she had tried to push away the poison of their words, but they echoed nevertheless, whispering that perhaps Alexander's regard was some elaborate mistake or cruelty she could not yet perceive, and by the time the first drops of rain began to fall against the windows of the dress shop, Clara had made a decision she knew was reckless but felt necessary, and she told Rebecca only that she needed to speak with the Duke urgently, and then she was out in the street, hailing a hack with shaking hands and giving the driver the Grosvenor Square address that she had come to know so well. The storm broke in earnest as the carriage rattled through the streets, rain sheeting down and turning the roads to rivers of mud. And Clara sat gripping her hands together, feeling her heart race with something between desperation and determination, because she needed to hear him say again that this was real, that his intentions were true, that she was not deluding herself into believing an impossible dream. The butler who opened the door at the townhouse looked startled to see her arrive alone and rain-soaked at such an hour. But before he could speak, Alexander himself appeared in the entrance hall as though he had somehow sensed her arrival, and Clara saw his expression shift immediately from surprise to concern as he took in her distressed appearance, and he dismissed the butler with a gesture and drew her into his private study where a fire burned against the afternoon chill and the sound of rain against the windows created an enclosed, intimate atmosphere. "Something has happened," he said without preamble, his dark eyes searching her face with that complete attention that still made her feel transparent and vulnerable. "Tell me what has distressed you." Clara found that the words would not come at first, that her throat had closed around the confession of her weakness. But his hands were warm on her shoulders, and his presence was solid and real before her. And finally she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "My family has made me doubt everything. They say you cannot truly mean to marry me, that I am foolish to believe a duke would choose a penniless spinster seamstress. And I have tried to hold faith in what we have, but the doubts keep returning. And I needed to see you, to hear you tell me again that this is not some mistake or game." She saw something flash in his eyes then, something fierce and almost dangerous, and his hands tightened on her shoulders as he said in a voice low and controlled, but vibrating with barely contained anger, "Your family has done you a great cruelty, Clara. They have spent your whole life making you doubt your own worth, and I will not allow them to poison what we have. So hear me now, and let there be no further question. I love you. I have loved you since I first saw you bent over your work with such complete absorption and grace. I love your kindness and your talent and your honest heart. And I intend to marry you and make you my Duchess, and spend the remainder of my life ensuring that you never again doubt that you are valued beyond measure." Clara felt tears spill over then, tears of relief and overwhelming emotion, and she whispered, "I am sorry. I should not have doubted." But Alexander shook his head and drew her closer, saying, "You have been trained to doubt yourself by people who should have protected you. But I will teach you differently. I will show you every day until you believe it, that you are everything I could want." And then his hands moved to frame her face with a gentleness that belied his fierce expression, and he bent his head and kissed her. And Clara felt the world transform around that single point of contact. Her first kiss given and received with such tenderness that she understood in that moment that whatever the world might say, whatever cruelty society might devise, this was real and true and worth defending. And when he finally drew back, his eyes held promise and determination as he said quietly, "Let them doubt, let them mock. I will show them all exactly how serious my intentions are. No one will insult you without answering to me." June 20th, 1818, and the evening arrived with that particular quality of late spring light that seemed to gild everything it touched, the sky still holding pale blue above the rooftops of Mayfair as carriages began to queue outside Lord Hastings's grand residence on Berkeley Square, and Clara sat in Alegander's carriage, feeling as though she had stepped into some impossible dream, because the gown she wore was rose silk, so fine it whispered with every movement. A gift from Alexander that had arrived that morning with a note in his hand, saying only that he wished the world to see her as he did, radiant and lovely beyond measure. She had protested the extravagance, of course, had insisted she could not accept something so costly, but Rebecca had fixed her with a stern look and said, "Let him give you this, Clara. Let him show you that you deserve beautiful things." And so now Clara wore rose silk with seed pearls at the bodice, and felt transformed even as some part of her whispered that she was playing at being something she was not, a seamstress pretending to be a lady. Though when Alexander handed her down from the carriage and looked at her with such open admiration, she felt for a moment that perhaps she belonged in this world after all. The ballroom at Lord Hastings' home was magnificent, all gilt and crystal with hundreds of candles blazing in chandeliers overhead, and Clara felt the weight of every eye as Alexander led her inside with her hand tucked into his arm, his bearing so proud and deliberate that it seemed he wished to announce to all present that she was under his protection and regard. Lydia stood near the entrance in pale blue satin, looking beautiful and cold, and Clara saw shock register in her cousin's expression, followed swiftly by something like fury, because here was Clara, plain, overlooked Clara, arriving on the arm of a duke, while Lydia herself had only managed to secure a baron, and the reversal of their positions was written clearly in every line of Lydia's stiffened posture. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and curious stares, the whispers following them through every room as society tried to reconcile the impossible pairing of the notorious Duke of Ravencross and an unknown spinster seamstress. And it was in the supper-room that Clara first noticed the 5 men standing together near the windows, their heads bent in conversation and their eyes fixed on her and Alexander with expressions that held derision and resentment, and she recognized them from earlier in the season. Lord Edward Thornhill, who had courted Eleanor before she chose Lord Sinclair, Lord George Ashworth, who had proposed to Lydia and been refused, Sir Philip Langley, who fancied himself a wit and social arbiter, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, whose family fortune was new and whose acceptance was tenuous, Captain James Fairfax, whose military reputation made him welcome everywhere, despite his modest connections, all of them men who had orbited her cousins or sought entry to better society, and who now looked at Clara with unveiled contempt, as though her presence here with Alexander was some personal affront to the natural order. She watched Lord Thornhill say something that made the others laugh, their glances sliding toward her with unmistakable mockery, and though Alexander was engaged in conversation with an elderly duchess and had not noticed, Clara felt the old familiar shame beginning to rise, that crushing awareness of being judged and found wanting, and when she overheard Sir Philip Langley say in a voice just loud enough to carry, "One must wonder what peculiar taste would lead a man of refinement to favor such an unlikely companion. Perhaps the Duke has developed a charitable interest in rescuing unfortunate spinsters," she felt the evening's fragile magic begin to crack around her. June 21st, 1818, and the morning arrived with deceptive gentleness, pale sunshine filtering through the windows of Clara's small room above the dress shop, where she had slept poorly despite the exhaustion from the previous evening's ball, and when Rebecca knocked softly at her door near 8 in the morning with tea and the daily newspapers, Clara felt a flutter of unease at the expression on her employer's face, a mixture of anger and concern that made Clara's stomach tighten even before she saw the folded copy of The Morning Chronicle that Rebecca placed carefully on the table beside the tea tray. "You should read this before you go anywhere today," Rebecca said quietly, her usual warmth overlaid with protective fury. "And know that whatever is printed there reflects only on the cruelty of those who spoke, and not on you." Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper and found the society column. That collection of gossip and speculation that she had never before had cause to read because her life had never warranted such attention. But now her own name appeared in print alongside Alexander's, and the words swam before her eyes as she forced herself to read the account of the previous evening's ball at Lord Hastings' residence. The columnist had captured with vicious precision the speculation that had circulated through the supper-room, quoting unnamed gentlemen who questioned what peculiar fascination could induce the Duke of Ravenscross to publicly court Miss Clara Pembroke, a woman of 32 years, without beauty, fortune, or connection, a spinster seamstress whose presumption in accepting the attentions of a duke suggested either remarkable ignorance of her own unsuitability or a calculated attempt to entrap a nobleman above her station. The article continued with what purported to be direct quotations. Lord Edward Thornhill wondering aloud whether the Duke had developed a taste for charity cases. Sir Philip Langley suggesting that perhaps His Grace found novelty in slumming among the working classes. Mr. Thomas Whitmore speculating that no man of sense could intend marriage to such an unlikely candidate, and that the arrangement must be of a more temporary and less honourable nature. And Captain James Fairfax declaring it an insult to every proper young lady of good family that a tradesman's daughter with needle-worn hands should presume to aspire to a duchess's coronet. Each word landed like a physical blow, and Clara felt the fragile confidence that Alexander had so carefully built in her crumble away beneath the weight of public mockery, because here in cold print was every fear she had harboured, every doubt her family had planted, every whispered certainty that she was not good enough and never would be. And surely Alexander would see now what she had always known, that their union would bring him nothing but ridicule and scandal, that she was a millstone around the neck of a man who deserved better. She set down the paper with hands that shook so violently the tea spilled across the table, and Rebecca moved to comfort her, but Clara stood abruptly and said in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "I must go to Grosvenor Square. I must speak with the Duke immediately." And though Rebecca protested that it was too early for calling and that Clara should wait until she was calmer, Clara was already reaching for her shawl because she had made her decision, and delay would only weaken her resolve. She would release Alexander from whatever understanding existed between them, would free him to find a woman worthy of his position, and though the thought of never seeing him again felt like death itself, it was the only honourable course remaining to her. June 21st, 1818, and Clara arrived at the Grosvenor Square townhouse near 8:30 in the morning, far too early for proper calling hours, but she could not wait, could not endure another moment with the weight of the newspaper's cruel words pressing on her chest like a stone, and the butler who answered the door looked startled to see her standing there, alone, without even a maid for propriety. But something in her expression must have conveyed her distress, because he admitted her immediately and went to fetch the Duke, leaving Clara standing in the marble entrance hall where she had dined just weeks ago in such happiness. And now everything felt ruined, poisoned by public mockery, and she rehearsed in her mind the words she would say, the graceful release she would offer him, the dignity with which she would withdraw so that he might find a woman worthy of his position. But when Alexander appeared at the top of the stairs, still in his shirt-sleeves with his dark hair slightly disordered, as though she had woken him, when he saw her and his expression shifted immediately from surprise to alarm, and he took the stairs 3 at a time to reach her, all her rehearsed words fled, and she simply held out the newspaper with trembling hands, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. He took the paper and read it quickly, his jaw tightening with each line, and Clara watched the fury gather in his expression like storm clouds, that dangerous quality she had heard whispered about but never witnessed. And when he looked up at her, his eyes held such cold rage that she took an involuntary step back, before realizing the anger was not directed at her, but at those who had wounded her. And he said in a voice that was terrifyingly quiet, "Who were they, Clara? I need you to tell me exactly who spoke these words." And she stammered out the names: Lord Thornhill, Lord Ashworth, Sir Philip Langley, Mr. Whitmore, Captain Fairfax, all 5 of them standing together in the supper-room, making sport of her presumption. And as she spoke, she saw him commit each name to memory with the precision of a man making a list. And then she forced herself to say what she had come to say, that she released him from any understanding between them, that she could not bear to be the source of scandal and mockery that would follow him if he persisted in this impossible courtship, that she was grateful for the brief happiness he had given her, but she understood now that it could never be, and she watched his expression change as she spoke, the cold fury giving way to something fiercer and more protective. And he crossed the space between them in 2 strides and took her face between his hands with a gentleness that contradicted the violence she sensed coiled in his frame, and he said, "You think I care what those cowards print in their scandal sheets? You think I would abandon you because small men with smaller minds cannot comprehend why I love you?" And the word love, spoken aloud in the morning light of his entrance hall, made Clara's breath catch. And he continued, "I am going to call on each of those 5 men today. I am going to demand satisfaction for the insults they have offered you, and if they refuse to retract their words, then I will meet every one of them and put a bullet through anyone who dares to question your worth or my devotion." And Clara stared at him in shock, because dueling was illegal and dangerous, and men died defending their honor. And she said desperately, "You cannot risk your life for this. I am not worth it." But he silenced her with a kiss that was nothing like the tender first kiss they had shared. This was fierce and claiming and left her breathless. And when he pulled back, he said with absolute certainty, "You are worth everything, and I will prove it to London and to you if I must face 50 men to do so." June 21st, 1818, and the hours that followed. Alexander's declaration passed in a blur of activity that Clara witnessed as though from a great distance, because he had sent her home in his carriage with strict instructions to remain at the dress shop where she would be safe, while he attended to what he called matters of honor. And Rebecca had taken one look at Clara's face when she arrived back, and demanded the full story. And when Clara explained that the Duke intended to challenge all 5 men to duels, Rebecca had gone pale and said that dueling was illegal and dangerous, and that men were transported or hanged if they killed their opponents. But Clara could only repeat what Alexander had told her, that he would not allow the insults to stand, that he would defend her honor even if she believed she had none worth defending. And so she sat in her workroom, with hands too unsteady to hold a needle, and waited while somewhere in London the man she loved was delivering challenges that might result in his death or imprisonment. And the afternoon stretched endlessly until near 4 o'clock, when Francis Carstairs arrived at the shop asking to speak with Miss Pembroke, and Clara rushed downstairs to find Alexander's closest friend standing in the showroom, still wearing riding clothes dusty from travel across the city. And he told her in a voice that mixed admiration with concern that the Duke had called upon all 5 men that morning, had demanded public retractions of their statements and apologies to Miss Pembroke, and when each man had refused, claiming their words were merely honest observations rather than actionable insults, Alexander had issued formal challenges to each of them for dawn chapter 2 days hence on June 23rd at Wimbledon Common, and Francis said that he had agreed to serve as the Duke's second for all 5 encounters, that the challenges had been properly delivered according to the code duello, and that already the news was spreading through London like wildfire, because no one could remember a gentleman fighting 5 separate duels in a single morning. And Clara felt the room tilt around her as she understood the magnitude of what Alexander had set in motion, because even if he survived the first duel, he would be exhausted for the second, and by the third or fourth His arm would be unsteady, his reflexes slowed, and any of those men might kill him. And she said desperately to Francis that this must be stopped, that she would publish her own retraction, would declare publicly that she had no understanding with the Duke, anything to prevent him from risking his life. But Francis shook his head and said gently that it was too late, that the challenges had been accepted, and that Alexander would not withdraw regardless of what she said or did, because this was no longer merely about defending her reputation, but about his own honor and his right to choose whom he would love without society's permission. And he added that the Duke had sent him to tell her specifically that she was not to blame herself, that this was Alexander's choice freely made, and that he would call upon her after the duels were concluded to assure her of his continued devotion and his safety. And the casual way Francis spoke of after the duels, as though Alexander's survival were certain, did nothing to comfort Clara, who knew enough of such matters to understand that even skilled duelists died from infected wounds or unlucky shots. And after Francis departed with promises to keep her informed, she climbed back to her workroom and finally allowed herself to weep, great tearing sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, because the happiness that had seemed so impossible and then so precious was now threatened by her own unworthiness. And if Alexander died defending her name, she would never forgive herself, and she would spend the rest of her life knowing that her presumption in accepting his love had cost him everything. June 22nd, 1818, and the day before the duels dawned grey and cool with morning fog obscuring the London streets, and Clara had not slept more than an hour together throughout the long night, her mind conjuring terrible images of Alexander falling beneath another man's bullet, his blood seeping into the grass of Wimbledon Common, while she sat helpless in her workroom, knowing that her unworthiness had brought him to this. And by the time pale light filtered through her small window, she had made a decision born of desperation and love, that she would go to each of the 5 men herself and beg them to withdraw their acceptances of the challenges, would offer any abasement or apology or public humiliation they wished, if only they would leave Alexander unharmed, because her pride and dignity meant nothing measured against his life. And so she dressed in her plainest gown of dark grey wool that made her look every one of her 32 years and more, pulled her hair back severely without any softening curls, and set out on foot through the morning streets to begin with the nearest of the 5, Lord Edward Thornhill, whose rooms were in a fashionable part of Mayfair, where Clara had never walked before, and she climbed the stairs to his address and knocked with hands that trembled from more than the morning chill. Lord Thornhill answered the door himself, apparently between servants, and his expression when he saw Clara shifted from surprise to something uglier, a satisfaction that made her stomach turn, and he said with false courtesy that he was honoured Miss Pembroke would call upon him in his private rooms. What could he possibly do for her? And the insinuation in his tone was clear enough that Clara had to force herself not to flee. But she swallowed her revulsion and said that she had come to ask him to withdraw his acceptance of the Duke's challenge, that the insult had been to her, and she freely forgave it and wished no violence done on her account. And Lord Thornhill laughed, an ugly sound that held no humour, and said that she flattered herself if she thought the duel was truly about her, that the Duke had needed no excuse to demonstrate his superior skill, and that Thornhill would not give Ravenscross the satisfaction of naming him a coward by withdrawing now. And besides, he added with a look that made Clara's skin crawl, perhaps the Duke would tire of his little seamstress once he had proven his point with pistols. And then where would she be except notorious and ruined, no longer suitable even for her needle and thread? And Clara backed toward the door, understanding that she had made a terrible mistake in coming here alone, that she had given this cruel man ammunition to use against both her and Alexander, and Lord Thornhill called after her as she fled down the stairs that he would see her at Wimbledon Common if she wished to watch her lover bleed for her presumption. And Clara emerged onto the street with tears blurring her vision and the crushing knowledge that she had accomplished nothing except perhaps to make everything worse, and she abandoned her plan to visit the other 4 men, and instead turned her steps toward the one place she might find comfort, Rebecca's shop, where she arrived near 9 o'clock looking so distraught that Rebecca immediately pulled her into the private workroom and held her while she wept out the story of her failed attempt to prevent the duels and her growing certainty that Alexander would be killed defending a woman who was not worth the cost of his honor or his life. Rebecca held Clara while she wept, and then sat her down with a cup of strong tea, and said in a voice that was both gentle and firm that Clara must listen carefully because what she was about to say was important. And she told Clara that she had known Alexander Drummond for nearly 10 years, had made clothing for various women in his life, though never a wife because he had never come close to marrying until now, and in all that time she had watched him move through society with a kind of restless dissatisfaction, a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered, which was someone who saw past his title and his reputation to the lonely human being beneath. And Rebecca said that she had observed the Duke during his visits to the shop over these past weeks, and she had seen something in his face when he looked at Clara that she had never seen before, a softness and a hope, and a kind of wonder, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune in finding her. And she told Clara that Alexander was not a fool or a madman, but a man who had finally found what he had been searching for, and who would not give it up, regardless of what society thought or what dangers he had to face. And she said that Clara's belief that she was unworthy of his love was precisely the kind of thinking that men like Lord Thornhill and his companions relied upon to keep women like Clara in their place, accepting the crumbs of life and never reaching for more. And Rebecca leaned forward and took both of Clara's hands in hers and said that the Duke had chosen Clara not despite her age or her station or her plain appearance, but because of who she was beneath all those superficial things, because he had seen her skill and her intelligence and her quiet dignity and her capacity for deep feeling, and he had recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who like himself had been lonely in the midst of crowds, someone who understood what it meant to be seen only for surface things while the truth of one's character went unnoticed. And Rebecca said that if Clara truly loved Alexander, then she owed him the courtesy of believing that he knew his own mind and his own heart, that she owed him the respect of accepting that his love was real and his choice was deliberate, and most importantly, that she owed him the trust to let him fight for her, if that was what he chose to do, because to deny him that right was to treat him as a child who could not make his own decisions rather than as a man who had weighed the costs and found her worth any price. And Rebecca added that the 5 men Alexander would face tomorrow were skilled enough, but none of them were driven by anything more than wounded pride and social embarrassment, while Alexander would be fighting for love. And that made all the difference, because a man fighting for love was a man who would not permit himself to lose. And Clara sat in silence, absorbing Rebecca's words and feeling something shift inside her chest, a movement away from the self-doubt that had governed her entire life and toward something that felt dangerously like belief. And she realized that Rebecca was right, that her insistence on her own unworthiness was not humility, but rather a kind of pride, an arrogant certainty that she knew better than Alexander what he should want and whom he should love. And she understood that if she truly respected him, then she had to respect his choice, had to believe him when he said she was worthy, had to trust that he knew the value of what he had found in her. And she raised her eyes to Rebecca's face and said in a voice that shook only slightly that she would not try to stop the duels, that she would wait and pray and believe that Alexander would return to her safely, and that when he did, she would accept his love without further doubt or protest, would step into the role of his duchess with whatever courage and grace she could summon, because he deserved a woman who was brave enough to stand beside him rather than one who shrank from the gift he offered. And Rebecca smiled and squeezed her hands and said that this was wisdom, that this was the beginning of Clara truly understanding her own worth. And the two women sat together in the workroom as the afternoon light faded and evening came on, and Clara felt something settle in her heart, a quiet resolution that whatever came tomorrow, she would face it not as a frightened girl, but as a woman who had finally learned to believe she deserved to be loved. June 23rd, 1818, and the morning of the duels arrived with a clarity that seemed cruel in its brightness, the sky pale blue and cloudless, as though nature itself refused to acknowledge the violence about to unfold. And Clara woke in the small room above Rebecca's shop, where she had spent the night, her friend having insisted she not be alone during these terrible hours, and she dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue muslin that Rebecca had chosen for her, saying that if Clara was to wait for news of Alexander's fate, then she would do so, looking like the Duchess she was about to become, rather than a frightened girl in a workroom. And Rebecca herself was already awake and dressed when Clara came downstairs, and the two women took tea in the kitchen, though neither could eat anything. And Rebecca said that Francis Carstairs had sent word the night before that the duels would take place at Wimbledon Common beginning at dawn, that Alexander would face each man in succession with 30 minutes between each meeting to allow time for examination by a surgeon and for the field to be cleared, and that he had requested Clara not attempt to be present because he could not focus properly on the work before him if he was worried about her witnessing violence. And Clara had agreed to this because she understood that her presence would be a distraction he could not afford. But now, as the morning light grew stronger, and she knew that even at this moment Alexander might be standing across a field from Lord Thornhill with a pistol in his hand, she found the waiting nearly unbearable, and had to grip her teacup with both hands to keep them from shaking, and Rebecca sat across from her and talked steadily about inconsequential things, the new shipment of fabric that had arrived yesterday, the dress she was making for Lady Ashford's daughter, the way the roses were blooming early this year in the small garden behind the shop, and Clara understood that Rebecca was trying to distract her, and was grateful even though the words seemed to come from very far away. And the clock on the mantel ticked through the minutes with excruciating slowness, and Clara found herself counting each tick and trying to calculate how long each duel might take, how many minutes for the men to take their positions, how many seconds between the command to fire and the sound of shots, how long before they would know if Alexander was hurt or whole. And she thought about the 5 men he was facing, and wondered which of them was the best shot, which posed the greatest danger, whether any of them felt regret now for the words they had spoken and the insults they had published, whether they understood that they had forced a reckoning not just with Alexander, but with their own cruelty. And she prayed wordlessly and constantly that he would return to her unharmed, that she would have the chance to tell him again that she believed in his love and in her own worthiness to receive it, that she would not waste the gift he was offering her through doubt or fear. And Rebecca reached across the table and took her hand and said that Alexander was the finest shot she had ever heard of, and that he would come back to Clara because he had too much to live for to permit any other outcome. And Clara held tight to Rebecca's hand and to those words as the morning stretched on, and they waited for news from Wimbledon Common, where the man she loved was fighting 5 duels in succession to defend her honour and prove to all of London that she was worth any price he had to pay. The news reached the shop at 11:30 in the morning, carried by Francis Carstairs himself, who arrived in Alexander's own carriage, looking exhausted but triumphant, and Clara heard the commotion from upstairs, where she had been sitting frozen in the same chair for nearly 4 hours, and she rose on unsteady legs and made her way down the narrow staircase, gripping the banister with white-knuckled hands, while Rebecca rushed to meet Francis in the doorway. And Clara heard his voice saying that it was over, and the Duke was unharmed, and all 5 men had been met and defeated, and she felt her knees buckle and had to sit down suddenly on the bottom step while the room seemed to tilt around her. And Francis came to her side immediately and knelt down so that he could look into her face, and he told her in a voice rough with fatigue and emotion that Alexander had faced each man in turn, beginning with Lord Thornhill at dawn and ending with Captain Fairfax just after 10 o'clock, and that in each case Alexander had followed the same deliberate pattern, waiting for his opponent to fire first, and then with perfect control, shooting to wound rather than kill, striking Lord Thornhill in the shoulder and Lord Ashworth in the upper arm and Sir Langley in the side, where the bullet passed clean through without striking any vital organs, and Mr. Whitmore in the thigh, and Captain Fairfax in his right hand, which would prevent him from holding a pistol or a pen for many weeks to come. And Francis said that Alexander had stood calm and steady through all 5 encounters, had not flinched when the bullets flew past him, had aimed with a precision that spoke of absolute mastery, and had made it clear to every witness present that he could have killed any of the 5 men, but chose mercy instead because his purpose was not murder, but correction. A public demonstration that insults against Clara Pembroke would be met with immediate and devastating consequences. And Francis told Clara that after the final duel, Alexander had stood in the center of that field, with the smoke still clearing, and had addressed the assembled witnesses, perhaps 30 men of rank and social standing who had come to watch, and he had said in a voice that carried across the common that Clara Pembroke was under his protection and would soon be his Duchess, that any man who questioned her worth or spoke against her honor would answer to him personally, and that he would be pleased to meet as many challenges as society cared to provide, because he would never tire of defending the woman he loved. And Francis said that there had been absolute silence after that declaration, and then, one by one, the witnesses had nodded or murmured agreement, and Francis had watched the social calculation happen in real time as these men of influence recognized that opposing the Duke's choice would be both dangerous and futile, that Alexander had drawn a line in the blood spilled on Wimbledon Common and dared anyone to cross it, and Francis told Clara that Alexander was on his way to her now, that he had only stopped at home long enough to wash and change his clothing and see the surgeon who confirmed he had not received so much as a scratch, and that he had sent Francis ahead to tell Clara he was safe and to beg her to wait for him, and Clara found that she was crying and could not speak, but only nod, while Rebecca brought her water and held her hand, and Francis smiled at her with great gentleness and said that she should prepare herself, because Alexander intended to take her directly to obtain a special license and would brook no further delays or doubts, that he had fought 5 duels before noon and would marry her before the week was out if she would have him. And Clara laughed through her tears and said that she would have him today if it could be arranged, that she would marry him this very hour, because she had learned during those terrible minutes of waiting that life was too precious and love too rare to waste another moment in fear or hesitation.